Thank you for that. Good morning. Thanks very much for inviting me to be with you today in this beautiful place. Robert Frost said that hell is a half-empty auditorium. This is pretty close to heaven. So I'm going to talk a bit this morning about our origin story as opposed to our origin myth, and then we'll open it up to your questions and your comments. The great Harvard naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison said that we have to read history because it will help us to behave better. Now this from a man who, when interrupted by a barking dog when working at his desk one day, went out and shot it. One thing we know about history is that, like life, it's infuriatingly complicated. We see that in the current reevaluation of Robert E. Lee and other Confederate leaders. Rarely do we find history simple, linear, neatly beveled, sanded, and varnished smooth. And so it is with the American Revolution, which to my eye makes it all the more compelling. I spent almost 15 years writing a 3-volume, 750,000-word narrative about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. And even before I finished the final volume and it was published, I was pondering what to do next, and I kept thinking, we can see his name right across the hallway here, of Jack London's advice that a writer, rather than sitting back and waiting for inspiration, ought to light out after it with a club. And the obvious thing for me at that time would have been to pivot to the Pacific and do for that theater what I had done for the Mediterranean and Western Europe, but that would have required me to start World War II all over again at Pearl Harbor even earlier, and that didn't have much appeal. And besides, I couldn't shake a personal fascination that I've had since I was a kid with a different war in a different century. And so I took my club and I set out after it. So I've just this month begun writing the second volume of what I hope, knock wood, will be another trilogy. The first volume, The British Are Coming, was published in 2019, and it opens with an extended prologue in June 1773, when King George III travels to Portsmouth on the southern coast of England for a 4-day review of the Royal Navy. It's a fantastic, proud display of military muscle precisely a decade after the creation of the first British Empire, with Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as we know it. 1773 is the year the phrase, "the sun never sets" on the British Empire was coined. The first volume ends with the 2 battles at Trenton and then the Battle of Princeton in January 1777, which together revive American hopes that had seemed all but extinguished. Let me suggest that there is a lot to dislike about the founders and the war they waged for American independence. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves. It's 1 in 5 of everyone living in the 13 colonies when those fine words were written in 1776. Nor was it valid for women, Native Americans, or indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American Revolution, those who remained loyal to the British Crown, and even those who had some reservations about waging armed rebellion against their government, often were subjected to dreadful treatment. Public shaming, disenfranchisement, confiscation, beatings, torture, exile, and sometimes execution. Some were imprisoned on Hudson River scows anchored below Albany, or in an old Connecticut copper mine where they were lowered by windlass 70 feet below ground to rock-walled cells known simply as hell. Partisan belligerents metastasized into civil war. John Adams later confessed, "I would have hanged my own brother had he taken part with our enemies in the contest." Conformity, censorship, and zealotry flourished. In a defensive war waged for liberty and to secure basic rights, we Americans promptly invaded Canada in an attempt to win by force of arms what could not be won by blandishment and negotiation, a 14th colony. This was the first, but hardly the last, American invasion of another land on the pretext of bettering life for the invaded. The enduring image of a yeoman farmer grabbing his musket from above the hearth and leaving his plow in the furrow to go off on behalf of freedom is mostly mythical. During the Revolution, General George Washington's army was rarely larger than 20,000 troops, and on occasion dwindled to fewer than 3,000, this in a nation of 2.5 million people. Especially after the initial martial enthusiasms aroused at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill faded in 1775, relatively few American men volunteered for military service, especially if it involved enlisting for the duration in the badly armed, badly fed, badly clothed, and often badly led American Continental Army. And yet, who would deny that the creation story of our founding remains valid, vivid, and often thrilling? Even in February 2023, at a moment when national unity is elusive, when our partisan rancor seems ever more toxic, when the simple concept of truth is assailed, that story informs who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and perhaps the most vital question, the most profound question any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for. Indeed, at least 25,000 Americans, and possibly many more, died for the cause. It's a larger proportion of our population to perish in any conflict other than the Civil War. So what can we learn from that ancient quarrel? First, that this nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. Second, that there are foundational truths that not only are indeed true, but, as Jefferson's Declaration tells us, self-evident. And third, that leaders worthy of our enduring admiration rise to the occasion with grit and wisdom and grace. And fourth, that whatever trials beset us today, we have overcome greater perils, existential perils, before. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation after many subsequent struggles. It includes strictures on how to divide power and to keep it from concentrating in the hands of those who think primarily of themselves. We cannot let that heritage slip away. We cannot allow it to be taken away. We cannot be oblivious to this priceless gift or the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives to affirm and sustain it. Now, the American Revolution was not a war between regimes or dynasties fought for territory or the usual commercial advantages. Rather, an improvised struggle between two peoples of a common heritage who had been gradually sundered by divergent values and conflicting visions of what the world could become. The Americans, let's say us, won by embracing fewer strategic misconceptions than the British did. Certainly the rebels could be wrong-headed in believing they had greater economic leverage over the mother country than they actually possessed, or in caricaturing George III, who sat on his throne for 60 years and was shrewder, more complex, and more admirable than the overbearing ninny who still dominates our imagination and who once again is mincing across the stage every night in Hamilton. Yet George and his ministers made three critical miscalculations. One, that most colonists remain loyal to the crown, notwithstanding troublemakers in New England capable of arousing a rabble. Two, that firmness, including military firepower if necessary, would intimidate the obstreperous and restore harmony. And three, that failure to assert London's authority in America would eventually unstitch the newly created British Empire, encouraging insurrections in Ireland, Canada, the Caribbean, India. It's an 18th century version of the domino theory that would propel us into Vietnam 150 years later. Britain also underestimated the difficulty of waging a protracted war across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail, for 8 years, as it turned out. Expeditionary warfare, whether waged in North America in the 18th century or in Central Asia in the 21st century, is among the hardest of all martial enterprises. The British Army in the Revolution, unable to gather food and forage in the American countryside without being ambushed, relied largely on provisions shipped from England and Irish ports. But of 40 transport vessels dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775-76, only 8 of those 40 ships reached the King's forces in occupied Boston directly. The rest, the other 32, were blown by gales back to Britain or blown to the West Indies or were intercepted by rebel marauders. When the British moved to New York in the summer of 1776, having been evicted from Boston, and requested 950 horses to pull artillery carriages and supply wagons so that they could wage war outside of Manhattan, 412 of the 950 horses that were dispatched from England died at sea during the voyage. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Logistics is always hard in war. Ask the Russians. Even when the American rebels were fighting on their home turf in the Revolution, they faced enormous difficulties. Of 75 official letters that General Washington wrote in January and February 1776, half of those 75 letters mentioned munition shortages, often in pleading, fretful terms, particularly about gunpowder, which he just called the thing. It's difficult to make musket balls without lead, and by the summer of 1776, the Americans were desperately short of this stuff. In New York, more than 100 tons of lead weights from fishing nets, clocks, and window sash cords were collected to make bullets, along with the lead from downspouts and window glass cames and pewter dishes. Without salt, armies and navies couldn't stockpile the meat and fish needed to move anywhere. 2 bushels of salt, it's more than 100 pounds, were needed to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. Before the war, the Americans imported about 15 million bushels annually, half from the West Indies and half from Britain and Southern Europe. When the shooting started, the British trade embargo strangled 2/3 of those imports. To encourage salt works along the coast, pamphlets were printed with salt-making recipes. All the old women and children are gone down to the Jersey shore to make salt, John Adams wrote. But 400 gallons of seawater were needed to boil off a bushel of salt, and that took enormous stacks of firewood. Virginia spent more than 6,000 pounds, it's a very large sum of money in those days, to build evaporation ponds around the Chesapeake Bay, but collected in the end only about 50 bushels. It's perhaps the most expensive salt in the history of salt. Yet those problems, substantial as they were, hardly matched Britain's problems. The 1,000 tons of bread required each month to feed British soldiers in New York often arrived from depots in Cork, moldy and infested with Irish rats. And there is no rat as nasty as an Irish rat. For the winter of 1776-77, the British needed 64,000 cords of firewood, 70 tons of candles. The daily allowance of a gill of rum for each redcoat, a gill is 5 imperial ounces. It's about a gallon a month. Took an enormous amount of shipping space and gives you an idea of inebriation problems in the British Army. Let me talk for a moment about George, our last king. He's an intriguing adversary. The late Queen Elizabeth only recently opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owned as part of a project to catalog and digitize the papers from all 4 Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are 350,000 pages, mostly from that long reign of George III, and most of them previously unpublished. I was among the first allowed in to take a look for a whole month in April 2016 at Windsor Castle, just west of London, where the papers are stored. And every morning I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate, and again at the Norman gate. Then I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers, gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind. And he wrote not only most of his correspondence himself, he made the copies himself. And as you paw through these pages, there is a tactile sense of being in his presence. One of the things, he's a great list maker. Lists of British garrisons abroad from 1764 to 1775, of Royal Navy vessels under construction in various shipyards, of all his regiments in America with the number of officers, musicians, and rank-and-file troops for each tabulated with his arithmetic scratchings in the margins as he does his sums. George copied out his own recipes for cough syrup: rosemary, rice, vinegar, brown sugar, all boiled in silver. And insecticide: wormwood, vinegar, lime, swine's fat, and quicksilver. He was interested in everything from music and astronomy to horology, the study of time, and the use of manures in agronomy. He'd married an obscure German princess, Charlotte, as in Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlottesville, Virginia. She learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord during her voyage from Germany to England. They married 6 hours after they met, and he had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish, because nothing says, "I love you," like a bowl of goldfish. Valentine's Day is coming up, guys. The happy union proved fertile. She produced children with lunar regularity, eventually to number 15. And through all of this, we see that he is a caring father. He's invested in the rearing of his kids, even as he's trying to figure out the proper course for the British Empire, for the monarchy, and for his people. He's easy enough to dislike, but impossible, I find, to detest or simply to dismiss as a reactionary autocrat. The war he chooses to wage, and he chooses to wage the war, is brutal, bloody, and often savage. Unlike modern war, killing in the 18th century was usually intimate, face-to-face, often with a bayonet. That's partly because 18th century muskets were mostly inaccurate beyond 80 yards and almost impossible beyond 100 yards. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington and Concord and the British retreat to Boston on the first day of the war, April 19th, 1775, the Americans fired at least 75,000 rounds. But only one bullet of every 300 actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard round the world probably missed. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those in muted blues and grays. Duh. American marksmen, particularly those few with rifles which were more accurate than muskets but were harder to load, couldn't carry a bayonet, learned to target the brightest of the red coats, those that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes that made those coats pop. In the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th, 1775, the British captured roughly a square mile of American-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. Now, the British are coming is not something Paul Revere bellowed while galloping through the Middlesex countryside in the very early morning of April 19, 1775. that wouldn't have made sense to people who at that moment still thought of themselves as British. What he's quoted as shouting over and over again is, "The regulars are coming out," meaning the British regular troops coming out of Boston. But I use "the British are coming" as a title because it's a metaphor for what those first couple years of the war are about. The British are coming relentlessly, with most of their ferocious professional army, with nearly half of the greatest navy the world has ever seen, and with 30,000 German mercenaries, the Hessians. They're coming to kill your men, rape your women, plunder your homes, and burn your towns. It's a dire thing. Those are some of the nuts and bolts of 18th century warfare, but what are the emotional guts of the revolution? That's what still moves us, stirs our pride, makes us feel that those men and women of more than a dozen generations ago have something to say to us. Why is that? Certainly that revolutionary generation can seem so distant as to be almost a foreign people. If irony and skepticism are the twin lenses of modern consciousness, the revolutionaries often seem archaic. They are much less ironic and skeptical than their 21st century descendants. They speak English, of course, but they have their own argot, their own idiom, their own slang. For example, passing counterfeit money, widely practiced in the 18th century, was known as shoving the queer. Someone who died took heaven by the way. Lice and fleas were called livestock. British soldiers in Boston, by the way, sometimes referred to Americans derisively as Jonathans or Brother Jonathan. But these are minor differences. We rightly admire those Americans for their endurance, pertinacity, and sacrifice, not only displayed by men serving in the ranks, but by others swept up in the fraught events of those times. Lois Peters of Connecticut hadn't seen her husband, Captain Nathan Peters, in months when she wrote him, "Pray come home as soon as possible. A visit from you at any time would be agreeable." Meanwhile, she would harvest the corn, sell their oxen for enough cash to keep the family saddlery solvent, sew him a shirt, take great pleasure doing it, she wrote him, and keep faith with the future. All of her letters, "Your loving wife until dead." General Nathaniel Greene, Quaker anchorsmith from Rhode Island, makes one of the worst military decisions of the war by leaving 3,000 American troops exposed and vulnerable at Fort Washington on Manhattan Island, where in the space of 8 hours on November 16, 1776, they're trapped and killed or captured. But Greene picks himself up, takes a deep breath, and writes to Cotty, his wife, "The virtue of the Americans is put to a trial. I'm hearty and well amidst all the fatigues and hardships. Be of good courage. Don't be distressed. All things will turn out for the best." Be of good courage. He's speaking to us, you and to you. He's certainly speaking to me. The sheer drama of the revolution keeps it compelling and often thrilling. From the bloodletting at Bunker Hill, where one of every 8 British officers killed during the 8-year war would die in 4 hours, to the skin of the teeth escape by Washington and his army in the fog across the East River in late August 1776 after a terrible drubbing on Long Island. And beyond the battlefield, the theatrical power and pathos of the conflict surely outruns any dramatist's imagination. With apologies to Junot Diaz, who's in the next room. The abrupt arrival of the septuagenarian Benjamin Franklin in Paris in December 1776 to woo the French absolute monarchy into an alliance with radical Republicans. The 100,000 smallpox deaths in North America from 1775 to 1782. Those white men sitting in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, lashing at horseflies with their handkerchiefs while carving up Thomas Jefferson's draft declaration to make it shorter and much better. The many American families, Ben Franklin's among them, ripped apart by irreconcilable political differences. Some years ago, the distinguished historian John Shai, who taught at the University of Michigan for many years, wrote that the Civil War, like every other major event in American history, including the Second World War, has a tragic, human, two-sided quality that the Revolution seems to lack. The whole complex of revolutionary events takes on a smooth, self-contained character that makes getting the right emotional grip on the subject very difficult. My premise is that tragedy is the bedrock of every war because every war is about young men and sometimes young women dying young. My ambition has been to find that emotional grip, as Professor Shai put it, to revive the tragic, human, multi-sided quality that saturates the American saga from 1775 to 1783. Historian Bruce Catton considered the American Civil War to be what he called a redemptive tragedy. Surely the same can be said of the American Revolution. It embodied the enduring aspirations of an idealistic people and brought forth a nation abounding with a sense of destiny. No wonder the world was agog. The cause of America, wrote the essayist Thomas Paine, is the cause of all mankind. Even now, the war for independence offers clues to our national temperament. It remains a bright mirror in which we see the traits that fashion the American character, from ingenuity and resilience to brutality and pugnacity. We've come far in almost 2.5 centuries in power, diversity, tolerance, and sheer scale. But in some respects, those ancestors remain nearer than we know. Their existential struggle churned up issues that perplex us to this day, including individual liberty versus collective security, the proper limits on executive power, the obligations of citizenship, and the elusive quest for a more equitable society. The tacit primal question of 1776 persists in 2023. Who do we want to be? In 1789, Benjamin Franklin died at the age of 84 in Philadelphia, but a few months before he passed, he wrote a letter to a friend, and included one of the lines for which he's best remembered. Our new Constitution is now established. Everything seems to promise it will be durable. But in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes. What he's telling us, virtually from the grave, is that there's work to be done. The dream endures, but so does the struggle. Democracy is never a thing done, the poet and librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish told us, and his successor Carla Hayden is with us this week. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing. Even Jefferson's Declaration, our foundational secular scripture, we hold these truths to be self-evident, is dynamic, never a thing done, something a nation must be doing. The great Yale historian Edmund Morgan wrote that the creed of equality did not give men and women equality, but invited them to claim it, invited them not to know their place and keep it, but to seek and demand a better place. The American Revolution lasted 3,089 days, and the result was epical and enduring. The creation of the American Republic is among mankind's most remarkable achievements. Nearly 90,000 more days have elapsed since those horsefly-swatting men asserted a human birthright of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Keeping faith with those who fought, suffered, and died for the principles we profess to still cherish requires more than a nodding acquaintance with them, more than a perfunctory acknowledgement of their struggles. For better and for worse, their story is our story. Their fight remains our fight. Thanks so much for having me here this morning. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we have 15 minutes, I see by the clock, for questions, and I will repeat the questions so that everybody can hear. Yes, ma'am.
I loved your description of King George's document. Can you tell us about some other interesting primary sources that you ran across and found?
Sure. She said she loved the description of King George's, I'm getting a little feedback from the microphone on the floor, of King George's documents. Can I talk about other primary sources that I found? Well, probably the biggest, best collection of 18th century material in the United States is not in Philadelphia or in Boston or in Washington, D.C., but in Ann Arbor. You didn't know Michigan was one of the first 13 states. And that's because there was a wealthy Michigan industrialist who was a collector, somewhat like Huntington in LA was. There's a great collection of 18th century materials also at the Huntington Library near Pasadena, because Huntington was a collector in addition to the other things he did in his life. And the same is true in Ann Arbor, where the museum, the library, has now been collecting for about 100 years. And they set out initially, and this is the 1920s, to buy the papers mostly of British statesmen and generals from the Revolutionary War period, often held by their descendants who had fallen on hard times and were looking for some cash for great-great-grandpa's papers. And so the papers at the library in Ann Arbor include those of General Gage, who was the British commander-in-chief when the revolution began. He was in Boston. The papers of General Clinton, who was the British commander-in-chief for 4 years, the longest of any of the British generals here, and of many others. So what you find there is this extraordinary trove of primary sources that if you're an archive rat like I am, and always have been, it will knock your socks off. Sir? Have I been to the battle sites? Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, 15 years of writing about world, I grew up as an Army brat, so I got dragged to battle sites, believe me. But when I was writing about World War II, I went to virtually all the places I was writing about, in Tunisia, in Morocco, up the Italian boot from Sicily, past Rome, and then, of course, in Western Europe, Normandy, Battle of the Bulge, and so on. And I've done the same for the Revolution. I don't eat as well as I do when I'm in France, but it's vital for a number of reasons. One, the ground will speak to you if you listen to it. I hear them. It's important for me as an amateur to understand tactically what it looks like, what it feels like, why they couldn't get over here quicker, why they had to go this way instead of that way. And then, you know, in many cases, for our American battlefields, the National Park Service and others have done marvelous things. Those of you who've been to Gettysburg and some of the other Civil War battlefields know that. And there's a very concerted effort now to preserve more of the Revolutionary War battle sites as well as the War of 1812, belatedly. Because if you go to New York these days and you look at Brooklyn and you say, what happened here? Besides a lot of urban buildup, it's very hard to tease out from a landscape like that what happened in August 1776 and what was the largest battle of the American Revolution. Now it's Brooklyn. So yes, I do. I go to all of them. Yes, ma'am.
The amendment on the right to bear arms.
She's asking about the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, and the theories, some of them scholarly, some of them nonsense, that circulate about how that came about, why that was brought into the Bill of Rights. One theory, she said, is that in England you weren't allowed to own a gun unless you owned land. I'm not a Second Amendment scholar. That's past my period. I can tell you that, at the time of the American Revolution, muskets were as common as kettles. And I'll go out on a limb and say most men, particularly in New England, knew how to use them. And most of them had some experience in warfare either against Indians. There were constant incursions by Indians from the frontier in New England and New York, upstate New York in particular, or by Indians and the French. That had gone on for 100 years. So there was a sense that a musket was important. And when the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War came along, we were allied, of course, with the British in that. We sent lots of troops, again, with their muskets. Now, a well-regulated militia is also part of that amendment. That, to my reading, doesn't mean that every crackpot can go out and get himself an AK-47 or the equivalent of an assault rifle to go shoot up places where people are going about their business in California. So, it's up to the Supreme Court, and we've seen that they've been very loose in their interpretation of it recently, particularly, to tell us what it is that amendment should really tell us in regard to our common safety and our common sense. So when the Bill of Rights was passed, not long after the Revolution, the thinking was that a well-regulated militia is part and parcel of the way we defend ourselves. It's a way we have always done it since the founding of the colonies in the 17th century. We've come a long way from that concept, in my estimation, and a long way from sensible gun ownership regulation within the bounds, within the freedoms of the Bill of Rights. We'll be arguing about this after we're all long gone. Steve.
I'm fascinated by how long the British kept prosecuting the war, given the logistical challenges, the popular opposition, and even in the Age of Sail, presumably lots of downbeat reports about how the war was going, and the opposition to the war in Parliament. Charles James Fox. I mean, people in this country forget that the Brits were very much divided about the war. Now, from your experience in the Round Tower and seeing Reed's Clinton and Gage's papers, are they giving the king and Parliament a fair picture of how things are going?
Yeah.
Or is this just a matter of pride?
Good question, Steve. Steve Smith asks, he's curious about the prolonged nature of the war. It goes on for 8 years, and there are lots of British boys that are not coming home in boxes, because they generally didn't do that then, but they are dying. And the British are aware that their casualty rates are high and that it is a real drain on the British treasury. And of course, and I've just begun writing about this now, in the next phase of the war, the French are going to come into it on our side, and the Spanish are going to come into it, and it's going to become a global war, and the stakes for Britain are elevated considerably. Why is it that there was this willingness of the British body politic to stick with it? Were they getting false reports from the generals here and so on? The popular support for the war really did not begin to erode in Britain. There was always a loud minority in Parliament and in certain commercial areas of England from the beginning opposed to the war. But it was definitely a minority. And there were votes brought and profound debates with some of the greatest orators of their time, like Edmund Burke, and you mentioned Fox, whose abilities as an orator in the House of Commons has never been eclipsed, demanding that there be a reversal of this ruinous policy that the king and his ministers were pursuing. That never got to be more than, until very late in the war, never got to be more than a relatively small minority when the vote was taken in the Commons and in the Lords. The reason for it was partly the war seemed far away, even though there were boys dying there, and even though taxes did go up. There was a conviction, and I mentioned this in my talk, that if the colonies slip away, it's mercantilism 101. If the colonies slip away, it's the end of the empire. We need colonies because the way it works, they provide us with raw materials, they buy the stuff that we make. It is why we are prosperous as Britain. Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, he's a Scottish philosopher, said, "That's wrong, you got it wrong. That is not the way economies work. You will still have the opportunity to trade with the Americans, even if they become independent. You will be better off." George didn't want to hear it. Lord North, who was the prime minister, didn't want to hear it. Lord Sandwich, who was head of the Admiralty, didn't want to hear it. They didn't believe it. And so it's not until the bleeding gets really significant, with the French coming in, the Spanish coming in after the Battle of Saratoga in the fall of 1777, that the opposition begins to get traction. And it's not really until, and they have successes. Charleston falls in May of 1780. An American army, more than 5,000 soldiers, is captured. It's a catastrophe for our cause, the American cause. And so they're thinking, we turned the corner. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We've heard that before. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. Another thing that they were told is that if you are successful in suppressing this insurrection, you've got years, if not decades ahead of trying to keep what you have held. That if you think the Americans are just going to roll over and be docile, you don't know you're Americans. And again, there were people who made this argument very forcefully in Parliament, in the press. The press was overwhelmingly on the side of those who questioned the war to one degree or another. It was a very active oppositional press in Britain. And it was permitted, freedom of the press, and it was flourishing in England. So it's really not until Yorktown, which is the fall of 1781, that the whole construct collapses. North has to resign. The government essentially changes. The king never really acknowledges that he was wrong, or that he should have taken a different path, that he should have been more conciliatory earlier in the war. There were efforts at conciliation in 1778, but they were half-baked and unsuccessful. And by this point, the Americans have the bit in their teeth. France has come into the war, and we're not taking half a loaf. So it's, you hit on a very interesting and curious part of the whole fiasco from the British point of view about why they would stick with it as long as they did. Why do we stick with Vietnam for 10 years? Why do we stick with Afghanistan for as long as we did? These are hard questions, and they're not unrelated. Sir?
So you went to the library and you saw George's record. So I'm wondering how, let's say, for the year 2050, are we going to recover the history of today on the cloud?
Yeah. So how are we going to recover the sort of records that I saw of George III and the Round Tower in 2050? Yeah, that's a question. A lot of historians worry about that. The digits are potentially going to vanish into digit sphere. Are you going to read them and all the emails back and forth now? There's a marvelous paper trail from the 20th century back, and there's less of a paper trail from the 21st century forward. So that's a tough question, and there are people who are working on it to ensure that you'll be able to read things 100 years from now that you can read today. You might want to hang on to the beta systems that you've got at home. They may come back, but it's a tough question for historians and for our common heritage. I think we're done. We are. It's flashing. Thank you so much. Thanks again.